Dr. John Torres with NBC News on his Facebook Live. Doing what I usually do for these Facebook Lives. I go over headlines that you've probably heard over the last few days or over the week or so. Get behind those headlines so you have a better understanding of what it means, and particularly what it means for you, your family, and your loved ones, how it can help you get through the pandemic and hopefully help us and everyone else end it sooner rather than later. And then answer questions that you might have. So if you have questions, please make sure you send them our way. I'll get to as many of those as I can. But let's start with the headlines. First and foremost, this is the big Thanksgiving weekend build-up here. And I'm bringing this up for a couple reasons. One, this is the time period where typically, if you think about it in the past, we typically end up using this week, starting this weekend, to travel to friends or family in order to celebrate Thanksgiving with them. Thanksgiving is a huge holiday here for people to get together with family and friends. A lot of food, obviously, we eat way too much over Thanksgiving. We celebrate, but we have a great time with family and friends, and usually for years have stories to tell. This year is different because we're in the midst of a pandemic. CDC, as a matter of fact, over the past few weeks has been saying, and they're saying my sound isn't working terribly.
It's a little low.
Okay, let me turn that up, see if that helps anything. Let me know if that sound works better for you. But the CDC has been saying over the past few weeks that you have to be really careful over the holiday season. As a matter of fact, a few experts a while ago said that this 6-week period, Thanksgiving to New Year's, is going to be the darkest period of the pandemic. We're going to see numbers much higher than we've seen in the past. The problem is right now we're talking that the numbers are higher even before we get into that weekend. We still having sound problems?
They're saying, ask people if they're having some
Let me
problems.
know if you can hear me, because we're having some indication that we might have sound issues. So if you're having a hard time hearing me, let me know, and we'll try and readjust here. But essentially, what we thought is during this time period, the 6 weeks of the darkest period, going Thanksgiving to New Year's, that we would have higher numbers, but that we would start off with lower numbers as we got into the holiday season, and then those numbers would crop up. The problem is those numbers have already gotten higher, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but 185,000 cases yesterday. I don't think hardly anyone thought we'd be at this level this early in the season. So, what does that tell us? And what is the CDC saying? Well, the CDC yesterday came out. They had a press conference. And they basically, the coronavirus task force, along with the CDC, HHS, and everybody else, had this task force. And what they said, essentially, are two different things. Number one, they said no travel. They're recommending no travel during the Thanksgiving holiday. And I know a lot of us want to travel. I know this is a time period when we travel to go to places, but travel can be risky for a couple reasons. One, it can be risky because you could get coronavirus, but two, you might get it, not even know about it, and you end up taking it somewhere else, a different part of the country, and more particularly to somebody who's more vulnerable in the household you go to. So that's number one. They're recommending against any travel. And we came out earlier with travel tips if you are traveling. And essentially, what I tell people all the time, the less people you're around, the less often you're around them, and the less close you are to them, the less likely you are to have coronavirus problems. And so you want to be careful. You want to be around the few people possible for a shorter time possible and the greatest distance possible. That's going to minimize your risk. It's not going to eliminate it, but it's going to minimize it. If you are traveling A to B, if it's a short distance, car is the best way to go if you don't have to stop anywhere because you're in your own contained environment. If you have to go further, then planes are fairly safe, but you have to remember the airports before and after, not as safe. Not as areas that you can necessarily social distance, especially when you're waiting in line to get there. So be very, very careful. Masks, hand sanitizer, those types of things can really, really, really help out. But a couple of things that the CDC also said, on top of not traveling, they also said you should only celebrate Thanksgiving with household members, and they define household members because up until now, people were a bit confused. And here's what they said, which is causing a lot of consternation. They said if somebody is not living in your house right now, under your roof, physically in your house right now, then you should not consider them household members. That even includes college students. So if your son or daughter are away at college and they're coming, they're not under your roof right now, and particularly they haven't been there for the last couple of weeks, then that can be a big issue. Hang on a second, I think we're still having sound problems, so we're going to unplug and plug back in the cable just to see if that helps out. So if we can unplug and plug in the cable there, fantastic. And we'll go from there. Hopefully it helps out. I'll just check our connections here.
They're saying it's so soft.
So yeah, so more at this point it's connections for the mic, so we'll check that, and hopefully this helps out. So I'll go ahead and project my voice a little bit more. Let me know if you can hear me. So again, what they're saying is, and I'll repeat this, a couple things the CDC said. Number one, don't travel. Recommendation is not to travel. If you do travel, which realistically some people are, then travel safely, which means protect yourself en route. You want to be very careful. The other thing is, if you have any symptoms, if you have a cold symptom, if you have sniffles, even if you think it's allergy symptoms, experts are saying don't assume it's allergies or cold. Assume it's coronavirus. Don't go. But then they further defined it. You should only be celebrating with people in your household. And they defined household members. And this is causing a lot of consternation because what they said is if somebody is living under your roof physically right now, then you can consider them household members if they've been there for the last couple of weeks. If, on the other hand, they're coming from somewhere else, even if they're your son or daughter who are away at college, then they're not considered household members. Sounds like the sound is working, so that's great. So they're not considered household members. And so what does that mean? Well, that means if you have a son or daughter coming from college, that according to the CDC, you can't consider them household members for the purposes of Thanksgiving and coronavirus safety. So that means you have to treat them like non-household members, social distance, wear masks, all these things. I'm hearing a lot of groans from people saying, oh, and I feel the same way. If I had a son or daughter at college, I'd be the same way going, oh my gosh, these are my loved ones. I want them here with us. What do we do? Again, just play it safe. And that means, social distancing, hand washing, wearing masks, all those things to make sure that they and you are safe. Because in the past, what I've talked about is the last thing you want anybody to have at Thanksgiving is some kind of food poisoning or other issue like that. You typically want those funny stories of whoever fell asleep and, with mashed potatoes all over them or whatever. But instead, this year, there's a high potential for having catastrophe because of coronavirus being one of those stories that goes forward. You do not want that to happen. So that's the Thanksgiving one. Again, the CDC is saying two things. Don't travel, and household members are only people who are physically under your roof right now. So even college sons or daughters that are coming back, not household members, you shouldn't treat them like household members. So that's headline number one. Headline number two, the vaccine. We've heard a lot of vaccine news lately, and they'll kind of play out the week as it's gone forward. Last week, Pfizer made an announcement that they had basically looked at the data of their phase 3 trial, the preliminary data. And so they weren't waiting for the trial to end. They waited till they got enough cases, and then they opened up the data. And they said at that point, they'd had 94 cases of coronavirus. Here's what happens, is they end up having 30 to 40,000 people between Pfizer and Moderna. They had different numbers, but 30 to 40,000 people in their trials. Those people, half of them get the vaccine, half of them get placebo. And then they wait to see who gets sick with COVID-19. They need a certain amount of numbers. And the problem is, up until about a month ago, the numbers were low because we weren't having that many infections in this country. If you remember back then, we were 20 to 50,000 per day. Now we're over 150, 180,000 per day. And so they had to wait till they had enough infections. Well, Pfizer waited till they had 94 infections, and they opened up the data and they said, whoa, it looks like this is more than 90% effective, which is great news. That was a week ago. Well, then Moderna came along and they said, well, we got 95 cases, and ours looks like it's 94.5% effective. And so it's doing really well. Side effects are minimal. Well, then Pfizer came, that was Moderna. Then Pfizer came along and said, okay, we waited till we got the 170 cases we wanted, which were the number of cases we're looking at. And then we opened up the data, and they found out the vaccine is 95% effective. And so their vaccine is as effective, and they have more numbers to look at. And so what they're saying now is they're saying they're going to apply for the emergency use authorization today. They're going to drop the paperwork today. Yesterday, I had a conversation on Facebook Live. It's a series I do called Doc to Doc with Dr. Stephen Hahn. He's the commissioner of the FDA, the head of the FDA. And I asked him point blank, I said, okay, how does this work? Once they submit their paperwork, once they drop the paperwork, how does it work? And he said, here's what's going to happen. They're going to drop the paperwork today. We're going to look at the paperwork, look at all the data. If we think we have enough data, then we're going to go ahead and get together a couple of committees. One of the committees is called VRBAC, and that's the committee that looks at the actual vaccine and then recommends to the FDA whether they should approve it or not. The FDA is not compelled to go with what their approval process is, but it almost always goes with what they recommend. And so they, according to CNBC, they have said that the FDA is convening that meeting December 8th to 10th. And so he said what will happen is they'll drop the paperwork today, they'll look at all the data. If they need more data, they'll call Pfizer and say, we need more data, this isn't enough. And then they'll convene the meeting of that advisory board I'm talking about somewhere between 8 and 10. It'll be a long couple of days for them looking at the data. If at the advisory meeting they think they don't have enough data, they're going to go back to Pfizer and say, we need more data. Give us more information. And what he was telling me is they want all the data that Pfizer has, essentially. They want everything. The vast majority of that is going to be made public. The only thing he said is not going to be made public and he was very point blank about this, are stuff that is private information, private protected health information, which is things that we all keep private because of the laws we have in the country. But beyond that, the results of the study, the results of the vaccine, the side effects of the vaccine, he wants full transparency and he wants full data. He said once they get to that point, then they'll look at deciding whether to advise for it or not for this emergency use authorization. And so time-wise, he would not give me a specific day to try to hold his feet to the fire on that. He wouldn't do that. He said instead, usually what happens is they, after a few weeks after the data comes in, they meet, they analyze the data a few weeks later, they compile everything, and then they decide on the emergency use authorization, yes or no. So if you put it all together and put all the pieces of the puzzle, it looks kind of the end of the year when they're going to start doing it. And Pfizer has said that once they get that emergency use authorization, which they're very optimistic they're going to get, that day, within 24 hours, they're going to start giving people shots. And they think this year they'll have 50 million doses. By the end of next year, they'll have 1.2 to 1.3 billion doses. Remember, though, that the doses here, this is a 2-dose program for Pfizer. And so if you can think there are 330 million people in this country, if they need 2 doses, that's 660 million doses. And so that's quite a few doses. And that 50 million to 1.2 to 1.3 billion, that's not just here in the U.S., that's worldwide. So 7 billion people here. You can do the math as well. Moderna is expected to go ahead and drop their paperwork for the EUA fairly soon as well. And then the other companies will follow suit. The one that's next in line is probably the Oxford AstraZeneca one because they're getting pretty close too. And this was interesting as well. FDA only uses U.S. trial data to approve these vaccines, approve drugs and medicines. I asked Dr. Hahn yesterday, he said because of the pandemic and because of the need to get these vaccines out as quickly as possible, but in a very safe manner, is they're going to look at international data, particularly data from the UK, the Oxford trial, but they're going to make sure that that data is very, very good data before they bring it to use here in the US. And most experts have been saying, why aren't we using their data? It's good data. We should use it, but just vet it to make sure it's okay. So basically the bottom line here, expect to see this happen by the end of the year. People start getting shots maybe the beginning of next year, but probably more likely by the end of the year. And then it'll slowly ramp up through the phases of people who can get shots at different stages. And then last thing I want to talk about are the numbers themselves, the sheer numbers. Right now, yesterday, NBC confirmed over 185,000 cases of coronavirus here in the U.S. That's an astronomical number of cases. And some experts are saying by the end of the year, we could be seeing 300,000 cases a day. Problem is with those cases, we're also seeing over 2,000 deaths a day here in the U.S. That's a high number that nobody wanted, nobody anticipated. Overall, almost 12 million cases of coronavirus in the U.S., over 250,000 deaths from coronavirus in the U.S. These numbers are staggering, astronomical. If you look at other places around the world, their numbers are high as well. In some places, particularly Europe. Europe is having a big issue too, and they're wrestling with what to do with it. But if you look at other countries, they seem to be doing a good job. Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, they do a good job. The reason they do a good job is because they have more of these mask mandates in place. People social distance better. They've had these quick lockdowns where they'll lock down and reopen the lockdown. New Zealand, it's a prime example of how they're doing things correctly, but with a full understanding it's an island, it's a smaller country, it's easier to do that in an area like that versus a continent like, or a country like the United States or a continent like Europe where they might have more issues and more things to deal with. But again, the three main stories here, Thanksgiving, CDC is saying do not travel, and they're also saying that college students might not be considered members of the household for Thanksgiving, depending how long they've been physically under your roof. Vaccine, Pfizer submitting for their emergency use authorization today. Speculation is that the FDA will convene a panel in the next couple of weeks, and they'll start looking at that, and probably a week or two after that, decide on the EUA, the emergency use authorization, so people could start getting shots at the end of the year. And then 185,000 cases a day here in the U.S. Yesterday's case number 185. These numbers keep going higher and higher. Concern is they're going to go even higher over the Thanksgiving break, and that's why the CDC is saying no travel. Be very, very careful. Let me see if you have any questions.
Will the vaccine keep you from getting COVID or lessen the effects of COVID, much like the flu shot?
This is a great question. Will the vaccine prevent you from getting COVID or lessen the effects of COVID? Well, when the vaccine first was starting to be developed, and especially over the summer, most experts are saying, we need to be careful because this vaccine, we're hoping it's 50% effective, but more importantly, we're hoping that it can help lessen the severity of COVID infections. So what we're finding out now, though, and you're right, the flu shot, usually flu shot's 40 to 60% effective. But what I tell people all the time is don't look at that effectiveness. Instead, look at the actual how well it helps with complications of the flu, how well it helps keep you from being hospitalized or dying of the flu, and that's where the flu shot really comes in handy. Well, this shot, we thought it would be similar to that, but now we're seeing these efficacy rates, these high rates, 95%, 90 plus percent, and that's when vaccines, there's no such thing as 100% vaccine efficacy. There's no such thing as an effective rate of 100% in a vaccine. So when you start getting 95 plus, then that is a very good vaccine, and it's very good at preventing COVID, but it's also good at preventing complications from COVID. So what you're seeing is kind of a combination of the two. It looks like it's going to prevent a lot more than we thought it was. At the same time, it can also help prevent complications for those who do get it, because it's jump-starting your immune system, and essentially the way vaccines work is they trick your immune system into thinking they got infected so they're ready when the real infection comes by. So again, it's a great question. It looks like it's going to do both, protect us from getting it, and if we do get it, protect us from having complications from it. But thank you so much. Wonderful question. I want to make sure that everybody has a fantastic Thanksgiving. And again, according to the CDC, don't travel. And if you do travel, travel very safely, and consider who's inside your house. And I'm not saying don't have your son or daughter come over. I'm just saying be very careful when they do. You want to make sure that everybody's safe this year. Vaccine news. Emergency use authorization was dropped today. The paperwork for it, it'll probably be 2 or 3 weeks before we start finding out whether they're going to do it or not, whether the FDA is going to give them the emergency use authorization, and then probably by the end of the month of December, when people start getting their shots. And then the numbers, 185,000. We all want to be extremely careful over Thanksgiving, in particular this weekend. If you travel very safely, but hopefully you're not traveling, you're staying home this time and doing Thanksgiving remotely, and that way we can have further Thanksgiving down the road. We can get back to our old ways of doing it, and everybody can have a lot of fun and stay healthy and happy at the same time. So thank you very much.